Welcome everybody. Well, one of the main subjects of today is that we're going to talk about patterns of success in projects, software projects, redevelopments, especially in our market, ISVs. And something which seems to be very obvious is that you have to start every time you go for a project with a why. You need to really understand why you want to start this project and what's going to come out of it. And not just the why on the positive side, but also the downside. And it seems so obvious, but in many times we engage with customers or prospects where it is not really in place. And so people start with technical reasons, and halfway they find out that, yeah, there's no more money, or there's people at sales don't say, well, what you're building right now will never be sold to a customer. So again, it seems obvious, but it's really the starting point of everything. So next slide, please. And so what is really the business case for modernization, for building front ends? Many of our prospects and customers feel a lot of pressure from competition. They seem to have such modern interfaces run on all these devices, and sales is banging them for newer and better looking stuff. And the other one is, of course, you have to keep hold of the customers you already have. They complain sometimes, and in many cases, it's growth. And to us, I think it doesn't really matter which of these you choose, as long as you choose, and it's very, very clear for you on what the case is. If you don't have this case clear and solid, then better take some time to consider it. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, once you have a solid business case, you have the why, it needs to have some depth or dimension, because the business case on its own doesn't exist in a vacuum. It could be constrained by your human resources, your budget, your time to market, deadlines. And then it's also, it has a certain amount of risk and uncertainty that it's naturally, it's natural that it would have that. So you have to identify these elements before you really can proceed with what you're going to build, how you're going to build it in detail. So when you're establishing what the scope of a project is going to be, you want to consider all the stakeholders. And we've seen in prospects we've worked with in the past where one of the groups might have been ignored, and this can have big implications. So if you are ignoring a customer and deploying a conversion from an old to new, if they get ignored, then they're going to have usability problems. We've seen where the developer group is not involved, migrating from a 3GL to a 4GL, and they didn't get it, they didn't want it. So we see this commonly because they're not a part of the decision. It may be that you're going to do it anyway, but maybe those developers need to have the proper mindset, or maybe it's a different group that's going to be doing it entirely. Even projects where shareholders are ignored. So from a technical point of view, you want to modernize. It's the right thing to do. But is the business case solid? Is it leading to higher business value? Is it leading to increase in revenue? So we've seen where the wrong thing was built before, where it didn't lead to higher value. So it's important to make sure that all of the stakeholders are really thoughtfully considered.
Okay, thanks. One more click, please, because I think not all of the screen is showing. Here, there's some animation there. One more, please. Well, when you need to start to think about a product scope. And of course, everybody wants to rebuild everything when you think about UI, but we rather like to look at it as a minimum viable product. Because what you really want is to bring value to your customers as soon as possible. And this value goes hand in hand, of course, with the effort you have to put into it. So if you want to know where you're going to start, or the scope of your first project is, or the first even sprint is, you need to start thinking in minimum viable product. And this is a continuous chain of finding the next MVP. Finding the optimal, almost the balance between value and effort. And it really also puts emphasis on outside-in thinking. If you think about a minimum viable product, about value delivering to end users, you have to think from their perspective on their value, and not just inside out, typically done in very technically dominated companies where things like infrastructure and such like that are leading. So maybe a little background of what an MVP really is. So next slide, please. Typical companies, or typical technically driven companies, use the first chain of what they think is a minimum viable product. So first builds, when you want to build a car, first builds on wheels and then add stuff to it. But that's not really what MVP is. MVP, because these wheels don't really deliver any value to an end user. But if you talk in really technically oriented companies about the lowest line of MVP, they already see, engineers typically see that they're going to have to rebuild stuff over and over again. Because in their eyes, a skateboard is nothing like a moped, it's nothing like a bicycle, it's not like a scooter. So they think from the perspective of efficiency, and that's not the way to do it. You have to really start thinking outside in. Is the next minimum viable product really usable and adds value to my end users? Next slide.
Yeah, so the next step, you really have to determine how, because you have to choose a methodology. A modernization is different than, or a rewrite is different than organically growing a product over many years, or incremental maintenance of a legacy product. It's different because you can't know everything up front. So you really need a new paradigm. Next slide, please. So we see that the world of software lifecycle delivery is changing, and it has changed. And with organizations we've worked with, it's possible to achieve success by embracing Agile methodology. We're really seeing this change drive success. And by embracing this change, companies are also embracing mistakes. They're embracing risk, and they're learning as they go rather than trying to ignore change. And so one of the fundamental first steps is accepting that risk. And we know that a software project is imbued with a lot of risk. And Agile development isn't magically eliminated. What it really does is it accepts it, it accounts for all of it, and addresses it in the life cycle of the software development. And by this I mean it's addressing the risk in deployment, the risk in migrating data to a new database or a new schema, migrating customer data to the cloud, etc. It addresses the risk that you would identify in functional testing or quality testing, or the risk of integrations when they go live, integrating with other cloud services, for example. And we've seen where that risk is deferred, and that's the traditional model, where you see it on the dotted line there. That risk gets deferred to the end of the project, where people don't think about deployment because they're not done building. They don't think about migrating data to the new database until after they've completely designed the new schema. As Ron said, inside out. So Agile development goes the opposite direction, and it takes all of the risk. It's one of the core components of it, and incorporates it into every build, so that when you go live, there's nothing new, there's nothing different. You've already encountered everything. And it also allows you to bring the highest value to the customer quickly. Ron, maybe you can talk about the failures along the way.
Yeah, that's one of the things we've been mentioning to customers a lot of times, that we like them to fail fast. And that, as odd as that may sound, is that knowing that you cannot do everything right, that's just not possible, that you're going to make failures, you might as well make those failures fast and learn from them. And also, if those failures become too high or too big, they will hurt too much. And that's why one of the concepts in Agile is that you try to have many small serial projects. So if a small sprint, a sub-project fails, it only fails a little. And you can learn from it, and you can incorporate what you've learned into the next sprint or the next serial project. And that way, you set yourself up for success. And so it's a lot less binary than failing or succeeding. It's incorporating failure into your success almost. And again, we've seen companies that are very successful in this, and that's one of the main pillars of Agile. Now, sometimes people tell me that a big downside of Agile is about how much time is it going to take using this Agile methodology to finish this big or huge project or rewrite. That seems like a problem with Agile, because people put just a bunch of stuff into the backlog and we'll worry about that later. But in reality, that's not true. Traditional methods of scoping, like a waterfall method, are just as inaccurate in the beginning as Agile, because you can't know in a big project what's going to come up in 3 years and how the world's going to change and whether you want to adopt to that. So next slide. Agile scoping, the way we do that is we scope projects on a really high level, so really big chunks, and it's almost, I think, as accurate as a waterfall method. But one of the big difference with Agile is that because basically you scope and you estimate every sprint by pokering your points before and measuring your velocity during a sprint and getting better and better in that. And if you use those numbers, so especially the velocity of the teams, to project that on top of the future work, then the estimate of the total project will get better and better and better. So we typically see that teams who have done 5 or 6 sprints are getting really good in estimating, so much better than the 5 sprints before. And let's say at 30% of the project, the certainty of the endpoint which is going to be reached is so high, impossible that you could have known that in front with such an accuracy. And that's a big advantage of Agile over waterfall scoping. So in the next slide, another thing which is I think another big upside of doing things Agile is that when you talk about technical tasks, so doing things, programming methods or classes, to an end user or to a product owner, that doesn't really say anything. So the way that's embedded into Agile is that we try not to talk about tasks. We try to talk about stories, which basically represent functionality and complexity. So it almost creates a bridge between the end user and the people who have to really build something. So and talking about user stories and complexity and functionality rather than coding, or which end users doesn't really, it doesn't say anything to end users, doesn't bring any value. It gives a lot more control over the project and the execution, and in the end, the success.
And one of the tools that we use is to continually measure that that success. one of the benefits of Agile Scrum or Agile development is that what you know in the first sprint becomes clear in the second sprint and clearer in the third sprint. There's a metric that we use called the velocity. Technically, it means the number of story points produced in a sprint. And a story point is really, as Ron said, it's a measurement of functional complexity and not a measurement of what the developers and testers are doing. So really, it's functionality divided by time, and that gives you a velocity. And this is a key metric because if I'm a stakeholder, a product owner, and I'm looking at my project, the more that I know about my velocity, the easier it is for me to say, how are we doing? When will we be done? It's one of the ways that Agile can answer that question that it sort of seems paradoxical when you start saying, well, we're not going to estimate, we're not going to count hours, we're not going to say how long it takes to do all the technical tasks involved. Instead, we have an arbitrary measure of relative complexity, which at first means nothing in the first sprint. In the second sprint, yeah, you start to understand what it means. And by your 10th sprint, everybody knows what a velocity metric means and how complex a user story is. And you get a very inexpensive and a lot more accurate insight that gets better as you execute a project. And so you really know where you're going. You can answer that to the stakeholders. Now, it's also about the fundamental underpinnings of the application that you're building. Agile approach doesn't solve all technical problems. You can identify a risk and fix it, but in the end, it helps to have a solid foundation. You really have to make sure that you have a high-level architectural design, that you do any necessary proof of concepts on that design. So you need to verify that your connectivity strategy for your backend data is fine. You want to account for any non-functionals that might not be in a user story. So you have a user story. I need to do something functional, change my password, add a sales order. It doesn't say what performance will be. It doesn't say what the level of security will be. It doesn't talk about SSL or encryption. These are all the non-functionals. So you need to cover all of that, and you need to make sure it's built in, because you don't want to find out partway into a project that hey, the foundation is really wrong. It's different than getting a user story wrong. It's different than getting a piece of functionality wrong. And really importantly, I think you want to make sure that you choose the right tools and the right frameworks that might help you get a boost on that, so that you can just focus on your domain.
Yeah, another subject here is user experience. And in the previous sessions in this series, we've talked a lot about UX, a little bit about UI. I think it's clear to those who have followed those, but that UX and UI are not the same. But again, creating successful projects, and to me, success is, of course, that the end users are going to be happy. You need to involve the end users, or at least people on behalf of the end users, in your design process. Developers are not UX people. That's a mistake I've seen many times, and you end up with pretty poor UX typically, and end user will not be happy, and in the end, that's why the project will not be successful. So again, involve users and get UX people involved in the project to take care of this. Now there are some really, I would say, almost base. So next slide. Some base things which people really forget a lot when you talk about UX. UX designers typically talk about process design and happy flows and stuff like that. But there's a couple of things which, if your applications doesn't perform well and everything below above sub-second on a regular user interface is not on par, then you can make very good UX, but if it doesn't perform, people will throw it away anyways. The other thing is about using keyboards. A mouse is a great tool, but people you have customers who build accounting systems where people are hammering on their keyboard day in, day out, entering invoices or whatever. That you can't do that with a mouse. So things like keyboard access, sometimes access to hardware, building terminals or cash registers. You need access to the hardware. So there's base things which are almost fundamental to user experience, which need to be in place. And I've seen that being the end, people trying to solve that in the end, whereas that should be in the platform and in development from day one.
Yeah, it really helps if you can get a head start with integrating pre-built modules or frameworks or whatever you want to call it, because you really want to focus on your domain. You want to focus on the functionality and the user experience that you want to deliver. And there's so many parts about building an application which are kind of generic, and we've really seen where organizations spend a lot of time, a lot of investment in their frameworks, their generic functionality, getting something that provides consistency across their whole offering, only to then have to go back and modify it when a new requirement comes along. And then they're stuck with the cost of ownership of their own framework. They have to maintain it. They have to live with it. Where if you take something off the shelf and you can integrate it, someone else will maintain it, and then they can upgrade it as the world changes, and you're free to continue to focus on what matters for your user. So, things from navigation, security, CRUD control, personalization, customization, object relational mapping. I mean, the list could be very big if you think about generic functionality of an application. So it helps to start with the right tools and the right frameworks.
Now, I would say almost the last bullet point, which I always try to talk about with prospects and customers, is now that we're talking about this modernization project or this rewrite project or this new build project, you have to think about the life cycle of your application. So our typical customers, this is not just a project. It's something they're going to be building on probably the rest of their existence as a company. So we saw all these trends or all these technologies coming along today. HTML5, Angular seems to be a dominant technology for people to deliver their applications to an end user in the browser and even in a mobile. But we don't really know all, unless we look in our glass bowl, what's coming next. Is it going to be HTML6? So you have to take into account when you do a project, not to just worry about the project. You have to also always look beyond that. As a company, you want to make choices that you have to stay innovative. You can't be spending and rebuilding your application and your whole technology stack again and again, because that's not feasible. That will hurt your business model. And what I see companies who are most successful, they really try to stay focused and make the right choices, also on the technology end, on trying to focus on where their biggest added value is. And typical ISVs, a lot of value and have all these knowledge about this very vertical industry which they focus on typically, and try to focus on developing software just for that. So, of course, how do we answer this? Of course, we've talked about our technology platform, but on top of that, we see that we've seen in the past that a lot of projects failed in the industry. Many projects failed. And in some projects we were partly involved, some we did some parts, but we've learned a lot with all these customers, migrating them, redeveloping them, modernizing them. And so I would say 5 years ago, we came up with the idea that we need to start helping people and customers with these projects on a more deeply involved level. And we call this the assurance program. And it consists of many things. Typically all the things we've mentioned, of course, in the slide before. We try to help our customers with expert services, project management, product management almost, to make them more successful. So we deliver not only the project management, we try to help them gain control, take control sometimes. We sometimes takes over. And we inject a lot of expert knowledge into the projects. In the end, trying to empower our customers to really add the value they need to add, and to be successful in these rewrites, but also beyond that. Our technology again is focused really on trying to take away all the worries about future developments in the industry. And we've seen a lot of success with the assurance program, and also a quicker rollout of applications to your customers. So I think our conclusion and takeaway is we think you try to make this your last front end or complete rewrite. Maybe Ivo has some questions which came in.
Yeah, hey Ron. Let's see, I saw 2 questions coming in for sure. One of them is, I think when you were talking about the assurance program, Ron, one was, have you seen projects fail in your assurance program?
Didn't expect that question, but yes, I've seen that. As much as we like to say that if you go into the assurance program, it's impossible to fail. I think the biggest, if I into my mind, which were the ones which failed, there was only a few, where I think the why, especially of the companies that chose for a rewrite, typically didn't have their business case well structured or well up to speed. The quality of the business case was not good. So they failed luckily quick. They realized quickly this is going to take more time or more money than we will ever make back. Although fast with Servoy, but there's no good case for it. And I think that's one of the main reasons. And I think another reason was stakeholder involvement, typically with the technical end of companies, where, for instance, the developers were blocking the technology shift, typically from a 3GL to a 4GL. They just didn't want to do that, and then those stakeholders were ignored by the management team, and it wasn't vanished. I tell prospects that in some cases we see failures like this coming, and it needs to be managed. So sometimes people will leave the company because they just don't like the choices. If you don't manage it, then it will kill the project. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I guess so. What we've also seen in the past, Ron, was problems with accepting Agile methodologies. I don't know if you just mentioned that.
No, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, that was definitely.
And then yeah, and I think one thing that happened then is that they kind of accepted it, so they did it half, and they didn't go all in, and then it will hurt the project more than. It would be even worse than the traditional methods like waterfall.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think that that's getting better. Agile seems to be more and more accepted, and so going the right way there. Another one that came in is what's the single biggest risk you see in projects like this?
I think the biggest risk is building the wrong things. And that connects to a couple of things we said in the slide before. So also, of course, it connects to the why. If you don't know why you're building it, so if you don't know why, and that's also for who, of course. People just build the wrong things, and then, for instance, there was a complete disconnect between product manager and sales. Sales guy said, "I will never be able to sell this," or "The market we are in with this product is full," or whatever. Or just building the wrong things. It's a big risk, and you have to really know why you're doing it, and I think that's the biggest one for me.
Yeah, and not an easy one actually to prevent from happening. It takes a lot of effort to to do the right things.
Yes, and Agile really helps, and involving end users really helps. It will take care of it. So again, Agile here is a really good method to help you make sure that, because you can't know everything up front, right? So even if you think this is the right thing to build, right? Building it for 2 years hurts a lot, but building it for 2 weeks and then presenting it to a couple of your closest current customers and getting their feedback, that's really helpful, because then you'll know it's right or wrong before you have spent the 2 years.